Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Rational Standard, or as Sydney Watson says, welcome to hell. Um, it's been another very busy week. I don't think we're going to run out of these ever, but the craziness continues. I am joined by my friends Morné Malan and Zakhele Mthembu. Our other friend David and Sarah cannot join us today, but I'm sure we'll have a pretty kind of wide ranging discussion. I mean, the two biggest issues this week still land reform, no surprise. And the other thing is the non budget, of course, that Enoch Gonongwana failed to deliver. Lots of talk about how the GNU is working, the Government of National Unity, whether this might be the first time that there's actual coalition politics going on. We'll see. The budget has been postponed to March, so we'll see what happens then. And we'll get into the budget a bit later, I'm sure. But first, there's a somewhat less discussed topic. I don't want to say that it hasn't been discussed. I think the podcast circuit has picked up on it. But for our followers who haven't seen it yet, the Freedom Front Plus, which is a party in the GNU and in Parliament, pointed out this week that the Department of Land Reform and Rural Development announced to the Parliamentary Committee that there will be a so-called Equitable Access to Land bill that will be launched this year. The objective of the bill is to bring land ownership in line with the country's demographics using race as a basis. And the timeline is basically that it could be go through the cabinet process in March and then go through public comments in April and May and then be tabled in Parliament in October. And the idea is to rectify the skewed patterns of land ownership in South Africa. And the Expropriation Act, which we've discussed, has been mentioned kind of in connection with this bill. And yeah, the Freedom Front Plus is kind of encouraging everyone with an interest in land ownership to be prepared for this bill. I think that's probably the right sentiment. And yeah, just for readers who are curious, a bill of this nature has been there's been talk about a redistribution bill or act that lots of legal academics want the state to adopt. And they refer to Section 25(5) of the Constitution. And they think that this provision is an enabling provision for state redistribution of property. I'm going to read it and then we're going to go into the discussion. But I have my doubts about whether you can get redistribution from these words. I have a lot more respect for textualists now than I did 10 years ago. So Section 25(5) says, the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to foster conditions which enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. This will no doubt be the constitutional grounding for this bill. I don't think it works. But Morné, do you have any thoughts on whether this is something that the government should be doing?
It really gets back to something that we talk about all the time, which is that clearly our government's view of what it is that the Constitution and in particular the Bill of Rights does is something that is absolutely foreign to the rest of the world, and I'd argue foreign to the function of constitutions in general, whereas bills of rights are generally seen and understood and are, in fact, do serve the purpose of securing rights and protecting those from government interference. Our government, for some reason, tends to view all of these provisions in the Constitution as almost licensed to do what they want. So you have a right to property. That means government is allowed to take everyone's property and then to allow you access, which is also another important thing is government is, well, this particular government and, well, the government we've always had in South Africa is always really, when they do talk about redistribution, they don't mean taking it from one particular group and giving it to another particular group. That's, that can be debated as well. But what they generally tend to mean is taking it from one particular group and then keeping it in the state. And that's called redistribution. And that's why I think it's, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I think it's close to a quarter of agricultural land in South Africa is owned by the state, often to lease it to whoever they deem to be the proper lessees for that particular particular piece of land. But the fact is that that's not what a constitution is supposed to do. And the other thing is just it's been such a ridiculous debate that we've been having around the whole expropriation, redistribution, the fact that the Expropriation Act was signed, and all of us were just in this whole debate about just kabuki. Basically, we were all debating around it, or maybe not us, but many people were just debating around these facts. It was a sort of initially there were two claims. There was land will be confiscated, and that there's going to be some form of racial discrimination in the process. And to me, that was just uncontroversially the facts on the ground from the beginning, because I don't think there's anybody, regardless of their position on the ideological spectrum, that would say, I can guarantee that whoever's property is expropriated, they will receive fair market-related compensation in all cases. Nobody believes that. And I don't think there's anybody that say that would argue that race isn't going to form part of the consideration when it comes to expropriation. So those two things were true from the start, and neither one of those two things were ever really contradicted. And I think that had we just accepted those from the start and had people been willing to just clearly state that is obviously the intention from the beginning, then we could have had a debate on whether or not that's desirable. But instead of having that debate, it was a sort of, is this really happening? And the answer was sort of no, but it should. It really should be happening. We wish it were happening. And so in light of all that, it is no surprise to me that that this bill has come up. You mentioned that they've been waiting for this kind of legislation. I think that we do actually have quite a few bits of legislation, particularly when it comes to land, which already basically argues for all of this. So it's almost as though there's this approach that we had one piece of legislation for this goal, and we feel we haven't reached it, so we're getting another one. And I think this is about the third or fourth one that we're at now, depending on how you view the expropriation bill itself. But yeah, so clearly no lack of legislation which enables government to redistribute, particularly when it comes to land.
Zach, we had a discussion in our second podcast about how all of us kind of agree on restitution, that it's a matter of justice, it's a matter of kind of liberal and libertarian principle. I think we kind of disagree in the margins about how that should ultimately work. But what they're talking about here is redistribution. And lots of people, I mean, these words are very similar, but lots of people get confused very easily between them in the discourse. And I was wondering whether you might not just elaborate a little bit about what is restitution and what is redistribution, maybe just for the benefit of listeners.
No, I think, Morné has already touched on what redistribution is, right? On the nature of the South African state in general. Pretty much the state gets to take whatever property deems was, unjustly acquired or is unjustly held, because, if you assume that these are people who are operating off of premises of wanting to correct an injustice, they'll be like, this is property is unjustly held. And that premise, of course, what Morné said is, motivated by race, because the injustice was racially motivated in South Africa, And I think that particularly when it comes to the non-racial argument, I'm sorry, Morné, I'm going on a tangent. And you too, Martin. But I'm like, you mentioned how like the conversation was like, it was never disputed. I don't think in South Africa it can ever truly be disputed, given our history, that like most particularly conversations concerning land especially will be centered around race. primarily because the initial injuries were race-centered, and like so much of the history, right, is connected to that. So I don't think that we can truly escape that. We can try, of course, but I don't really think we can escape that. To Martin's point, though, the South African state has been like that, right? If you go back to the NP, it also lived to own the state. So redistribution is that. So the state, to own the land, that is. The state in this instance would be pretty much see a farm that is, or a piece of land really, that is probably idle or productive, owns that land. And then, as Morné said, instead of giving that land to, a community who would have a claim to that land, for instance, I know there's a community that has a claim to part of the land that is currently owned by the ZZ2 farm in Limpopo, right? There's like an entire land court process that is going on there that has been super prolonged. So instead of that community getting the land, should they be successful in their land claim, right? The government would be the one who gets that land, and then they lease it to either that community, or in most cases that not as would happen. I was reading a whole lot of what happened in Zim, right? They would instead lease it to politically connected people, right? They would lease it to their friends, they would lease it to whomever really can most likely grease their palms. But in the ideal sense, they would lease it to the community which has a claim, and then they would own it, because their biggest hoo-ha every time I listen to the government is that when they do give ownership to these communities, they go around and sell the land. And I think that's, I'm like, if you own the land, you are allowed to sell it, you are allowed to do whatever you want with it. That is the whole point of ownership, right? But I think that indicates what actually is the whole premise behind this. And then, of course, restitution would be, what would happen if, someone has a claim to a land, a community, or the descendants of people who were, unjustly moved or unjustly confiscated from that land. They would then have, an actual arbitration process, because, there will be people who also live on that land who also want to make a case for themselves. We have the case, we hear evidence, pretty much, how a court works in any instance. And then, whoever has the stronger case would be the one who would be entitled to that land. And most specifically, the land would not be owned by the state. The state does not act as a middleman in restitution. The community or the person or whomever really, whatever institution would be looking to, get a claim from that land would then have a right to that land. And if they're successful, the land would be theirs instead of them leasing it from the state. So this is the key difference between redistribution and restitution. And particularly in South Africa, right? Like the idea, people think that redistribution is restitution because it is couched in the language of justice, in the language of wanting to correct historical wrongs. But really, if you want to, if the government was serious about, justice and all of that, they would have capacitated things like the Land Claims Court, improve the processes there, improve the legislation that governs that court, right? There's so much that they could do that would actually translate to people owning. And then the people who are currently leasing the land from the state, they could actually give them ownership, right? But they aren't interested in having this ownership, at least in large parts, right? Maybe there are some who may be interested in that, but I don't think that in large part they are. So redistribution, restitution.
Sorry, Martin. I just quickly, Zach, you distinguish between the redistribution and the restitution, and I think you did that well. I just wonder, is it proper to refer to both of those situations or to both of those actions as a means by which to basically address injustice? Because you said that both of those are aimed at addressing injustice.
In intention.
But when it comes to, to me, it's quite obvious that when it comes to restitution, in that case, it's clearly righting a past injustice. I just wonder if you agree that when it comes to redistribution, that's also righting an injustice. Because to me, government's definition of an injustice is basically just that there are these two figures. The one is land ownership, that's this percentage. And then there's another one that says demographics, and that's another percentage. And the fact that these two aren't aligned, that in and of itself is enough of an injustice. But I just wonder whether you, not necessarily agree, but whether you see some validity in that argument.
Oh, no, not. I don't see a validity in the argument of like, pure demographic, comparison, right? But of course, there would be a correlation of demographic comparison, just like, if the more people there are in a particular area, then given our history, right? And the indigenous people here were moved. There's like actual historical records of them having their land confiscated and stuff like that. So, of course, in an ideal situation, the demographics would reflect that, but that should not be the guiding principle, right? That should not be like, we are looking for equalization of like, 90, how I don't know the demographic split in South Africa currently, but maybe a 70% and, or 90%, 10%, land ownership split. I don't think can really work like that because, as I said, I am a proponent of ownership, right? I want people to own stuff, and owning stuff means that you have the wherewithal to sell stuff if you want to. Sell it, do whatever, even if it means just sitting on it really and staring at the sun. That is the beauty of owning things. So I think it is impossible then if you are guided by the principle of just having a strict demographic split, because like what happens when more people buy land, right? So what happens when more Indian people buy land, right? So or more colored people buy land, that and then they happen to own more land than their demographics. Like then what happens? Like it really just takes us into absurd territory that we should not be entertaining. But back to your question about, I was thinking of it in an ideal situation, right? Like I like strong manning, even my opponents. I'm like the government, right? To be like, ideally, we are doing this because, in an ideal situation, we want to be the middleman. So you have this community A, and then there's landowner B, and landowner B, we think holds the property unjustly. We take the property from landowner B on behalf of community A. They are representative as their state, and then we lease it to them on behalf of community A because we own it, right? And then you think of it like in the most strongest of that argument, right? Jurisdictions like Singapore, even to an extent, right? Even though the UK has strong property rights protection, whereby you have 99-year leases and there's no really real property ownership, but that is juxtaposed by the fact that there is strong property protections and other elements of those jurisdictions. But you do have jurisdictions like that, Singapore and the UK too, like all land belongs to the state, but really you do own it, but in substance and technical legal form it belongs to the state. So that is the most ideal situation. So in that ideal sense, the land belongs to the state, and then the state will then lease it to everyone. The thing is, in South Africa, there are people who actually have, like real property rights, ownership rights. They can alienate that land. So it then becomes an inequality in that sense. But I was talking of it in an ideal sense. So that is how it can be construed as justice, right? If it was guided by the whole principle of having people who you have a claim to historically unjustly held land, right? Then the only difference would be that the state would be the middleman, pretty much, like acting between the person who has an injury and the person who has the claim. But yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, for me, it's important for people in our position kind of to disambiguate, because the state is doing this on purpose. Of course, they are trying to throw these things together because it really serves a statist authoritarian goal. So restitution is something that goes back, I think, in every legal system that I've read about. The Pacific Islanders, African customary law, Roman Dutch law, kind of English common law, all of them recognize restitution as a core legal principle. Even though they might perceive property rights differently on the margins, they do always say that if someone is not entitled to property and they take that, the person who was entitled to the property may get it back. So this is kind of almost a transcendent universal principle of law with a capital L that you'll basically find in the common law, not necessarily in the statutory law, but in the common law systems of, I would say, every notable kind of political community everywhere in the world. So restitution is very clearly a matter of justice. It's a matter of liberty. Even it's actually, you have weaker property rights where you don't have strong restitution. So it's a matter of protecting private property for you to have strong restitution. And now enter left people like Karl Marx, and they start an ideology kind of relying on a bunch of Frenchmen who came before them, that essentially says that, okay, cool, freedom is great, and this is a nice word, and everything must be related to freedom. But ultimately, there is this other thing. It's capital R reason, or capital R rationality. And that means that there is this objective ideal to everything that we as the ordained can kind of from above tell the world how things should look. And that is freedom, we say, as the central planners. And out of this, not immediately, but out of this eventually grows this political contrivance known as redistribution. This sense that there exists in heaven or in the ether this ideal like distribution of ownership. In South Africa, they happen to say, okay, it has to reflect the demographics based on race. Another country might say it must reflect demographics based on religion. Another country might say it must reflect demographics based on gender. In South Africa, we have race. But ultimately, it's the political class that decides this is how things must look. But even that is a coat of paint, a garb that is thrown over what is really ultimately just a political discretion. It's all about what the government of the moment might want. That is redistribution. So South Africa, I think our constitution is good on this. Lots of people call the South African constitution socialist. I think on this score, it is actually very good. And I find the text to be very clear. It says that if property was taken from you, you can go to court, you can prove that from you or your ancestors, you can prove that this property was taken. On a balance of probabilities, you win, you get the property back, or you get financial compensation if you choose. The innocent owner, if they are innocent, they also get compensated. Everyone's happy. Kind of, there is no zero-sum game here. And then it also says, and I read this earlier, the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resources to foster conditions which enable citizens to gain access to land on an equitable basis. Now, this to me does not say that the state may sit as a land czar and decide who owns what, where, and when. This is actually a very liberal provision. It says that the state must foster the conditions for people to gain access to land. What does that mean? Repeal subdivision regulations, make it easier for landowners to subdivide their property, to sell off smaller plots of land at more affordable rates. It means, having no property taxes for one. I think that helps foster equitable conditions for people to gain access to land, given how expensive land is and how government intervention drives the price of property up every single day of the week. But how people are able to square with this and say that, wow, look at the Constitution saying that the state must seize property, not based on any historical injustice. The state thinks that there is a skewed ownership pattern, on whatever basis it in the moment desires, and it will now take that property and in theory give that to a new owner. But of course, that's only in theory, basically never in practice. It always retains ownership. From what I've read, really is that the state leases everything that it takes from redistribution, not restitution. And that's simply not what our constitution provides for. So long story short, I think it's important for us to kind of disambiguate these things. One is, I mean, these words are so similar, and that's why I think a lot of people get confused. Whenever I debate the EFF or ANC people, they always come at me with a restitution argument. And at the end of this long spiel, I can only say, thank you, host. I agree with everything my opponent said. I don't know what the issue is, because they are submitting an argument that has nothing to do with what they are doing politically. Absolutely nothing. They are making a restitution argument, and then they make redistribution and expropriation laws that ultimately just come down to the state seizing more property and keeping it in ownership. And it's absolutely crucial for us to keep pointing out this sophistry that's happening, because they're interested in state power undermining property rights. We're interested in strengthening property rights. And one of those ways is to have a very strong and robust restitution mechanism, but not this kind of state redistributionary, ultimately socialistic, central planning, formula-based, ratio-based approach to property rights. Morné,
yeah, I mean, does anybody actually believe that, let's say we had this immense efficiency in the land claims court. We had, extremely motivated and highly competent people all working, overtime to make sure that every single case of unjust taking of land in the past. Do we? No, I don't want to sound too cynical about that, but the fact is there anybody that really believes that once that process has been completed, once there's no single person in South Africa that feels as though they were unjustly moved or removed or something was taken from them, does anybody believe that government will say, okay, nice, we've done it. Land reform is over. We have corrected all past injustices. We can now move on a what rule of law kind of equal treatment basis. No, they definitely won't do that because they're not. That really isn't their primary concern. And I think the reason why they use the redistribution debate is because it's something that is unobjectionable. Nobody really feels that. Well, maybe not unobjectionable, but most people agree about that. I'm sure not everybody does, but most people agree that that is laudable and that is necessary. But
you mean restitution?
What did I say?
I think you said restitution.
Well, they sort of muddle those two terms the same way that I'm doing right now, this is exactly what they want.
That is what they want.
But
I mean, what Jake said is
that they're going to be happy once they've done that.
I mean, what Jake said about, and I mean, this goes to your point, Morné, is that the state's issue is not that there's a skewed pattern of ownership, because once people own land, the politicians think that they sell it, and that, I mean, they sell it to some white farmer, and now suddenly the empowered land is no longer empowered, which is, I mean, that's not trying to address skewed skewed patterns of ownership. That is actually just rejecting the notion of ownership, isn't it, Zach? Because you get to choose for yourself. But I mean, just to add one thing, is that they do this with urban land as well, which is potentially worse, because they have these RDP programs and other state housing programs, and it's like the whole thing is dressed up as, we build you a house, it's your house. It's yours. You are a beneficiary of this program. Congratulations, cut the red ribbon. It's your house. But now, there's a precondition in your deed that says you're not allowed to sell it. You have to give it back to the state, because we're worried that you're going to sell your house. The horror, the horror of owners selling their property. I mean, I think that is a final confirmation that the political class in this country is not interested in kind of fixing ownership in South Africa. It is interested in owning.
Yeah. That is why you're right. Your last point, it is interested in owning. That is why I don't think they are opposed to the concept of ownership. They are opposed to the concept of ownership for everyone but themselves. It's the nature of politicians, particularly ones who have been in power for as long as, the ANC politicians have been, right? Like, these are people who have normalized the idea that, like, if you read the stories of these farms that they dole out to politicians, and then they host parties in them, and, like, nothing productive ever happens on them. So this is what they want. They want control, social engineering, right? And this is why really I'm such a proponent of liberty, and why liberty is scary to them, is that they inherently don't believe that people, when left to their own devices, can take decisions that are good for them. And because that they come from a different ideological viewpoint, they think that since people, for instance, if someone were to get land and sell it, they'll be like, oh no, how dare they do that, right? To sell it to a white farmer, how dare they do that? As you said, they look at that as someone, the land no longer being, justly acquired. But I'm like, no, that person chose to do that. Who are you to invalidate that person's choice, even though you disagree with it? And I think really the core of it is that they're running away from the work, right? They don't want to do the work of convincing people. That's why I love liberty so much. We can't fight people. So when people come over to our sides, we know they're actually, are convinced by something, whereas they believe in fighting people. So they don't want to do the work of, if there is an argument like, hey, maybe don't sell your land immediately after you get it and try to get it productive if you are interested in capital accumulation. But they don't do that. Instead, they're like, you are barred from selling it, which is just absurd, right? But you are correct. They want to be the owners. That is the whole point, really. Why they use, and they know the best way to get to be the owners is through the restitution argument, as Morné said. So like really, it is like using restitution to get the emotional cachet for the support that you need, so that you can then have redistribution. And in a couple of years' time, they'll be smuggling gold out of the country like the Zimbabwean government officials are doing.
No, exactly. It's it's just a shame that, I mean, it's concept creep almost of restitution, because in the political mind, and I don't just include the politicians now, but politically conscious South Africans, restitution and the very legitimate kind of basis of it has come to embrace this kind of whole kind of program of really, as you say, politically kind of centered, state-centered interventions. And I mean, it's I was on a podcast with Tude Jager 2 weeks ago, and I mean, he makes the point that black farmers who have the few who have chosen to take land from restitution and who actually farm on their own farms, they do just as well as white farmers. There's no racial kind of, you don't have soil in your veins if you're of one ethnicity or the other that makes you able to farm. So there's no racial kind of disability to being able to farm. But what he points to, and what is necessarily kind of obviously right, is that it's all this redistribution land. The last numbers I had was it's maybe 2018, that there were 4,000 redistribution farms, and they all kind of stayed in state ownership. And these are going to be of various shapes and sizes. And they were all leased out in terms of the state, I think it's called the State Land Use and Lease Policy or something like that. And these are the farms that fall into disrepair. These are the farms that don't actually produce anything. The beneficiaries are basically always going to be black, obviously. And now people are going to have this impression that, oh, black people can't farm. No, it is that non-owners do not have an incentive to farm. Because why would they? You're essentially a glorified farm worker without a salary, as Morné said before the show. And you're now expected to be this successful kind of mega black industrialist farmer without a title deed, without the ability to mortgage your property, without your name on the header of the farm. No, it's the Department of Land Reform's name on the header of the farm. That is absolutely bizarre. And now we've allowed this concept creep to kind of envelop this within the notion of restitution. And now we have our work cut out for us, because we have this very just pro-property mechanism, Restitution of Land Rights Act. I think that process has gone relatively well, given the bad budget that the state gives it and the undercapacitated land claims court. I think that the law is written reasonably well. I think it makes sense. You prove, if proven, you get the land back or you get financial compensation. I think, Morné, you pulled up some numbers a week ago. I think you said about 2.1 million beneficiaries have gone through the land reform, the restitution process. Something around there. I'm sure it can be far better, but now we have to defend that. But now there's all this other noise around it that's actually the stuff that destroys economies. And as Zake says, that's the stuff that leads to people trying to kind of do business with pieces of gold and politicians smuggling gold out of the country. So yeah, it's actually a problem. But Morné, you had something?
No, I was just going to confirm. I think it was around 2.1, I think, indirect beneficiaries. So that includes not just the direct beneficiaries, but their families or all the other people as well. And I think actually purely on the land claims restitution part, I think it's close to 50-50. Not quite, but I think it's close to 50-50 in terms of the people opting for financial compensation versus opting for land restitution. But just, Martin, you said something there, and I think it is important to just focus in on one particular term. When it comes to these sort of restitution thing, restitution matters, to me that it makes sense to talk about beneficiaries because they have benefited from the system. Oh well, I think even in that case it might be controversial, seeing as that it's more of a restoring a previous damage. So even in that case it might be a little bit controversial. But I think when it comes to the redistribution, when it comes to the state taking control of this land, it's not obvious to me in what sense that person who's having to lease that or who has leased that property, which is doomed to fail and which not only do you not have the ability to mortgage or any of those other things, often those things, those parcels of land come with a lot of prescripts from the government itself that they say, no, but wait, you have to farm with this and you have to use these and all sorts of things. So there are plenty of strings attached. But the thing I just like us to talk about is just this notion of a beneficiary. In what sense is that person really a beneficiary of a system if that system is doing nothing to actually empower them? And if that system, particularly when that system is damaging to the overall economy. And the reason why I'm thinking of this is because it relates to something that Zakes actually said earlier, and that is, I can't quite remember the exact wording, but it it basically just drew this sort of equivalence between the apartheid government and the current government. And I think people often have this very contrasting view where evidently everybody thinks that the previous dispensation were these hyper capitalists and the current government is just a more balanced mixed economy kind of approach. I disagree on both, and I think that it's worthwhile also just emphasizing that we've had massive state intervention in the economy, in society, and we've also borne the fruits of that. And the same way that it's not obvious to me that these people who must lease property under a redistribution scheme are beneficiaries, I think there are plenty of people. There's a sort of almost a flippant kind of way in which people talk about beneficiaries of apartheid, where I think the same principle applies. And this is maybe a little bit more of a controversial take, but to me, if you've got a bad economic system, if you've got an economic system that's damaging the overall economy, then that's a system in which everybody who's subject to that economy or part of that economy is a victim. To me, it's not obvious that you can refer to beneficiaries of a system when, given a different system, given a more free market system, they would have been better off. Everyone would have been better off. It's sort of the same argument that many people make when it comes to the BEE affirmative action policies, which is that often the biggest victims of those are Black people. Not that I think that the biggest victims of apartheid were white people, but I also don't think that whites as a broad group, I also think it was very much the same system where you had this connected elite that benefited greatly. But to me, I can't really see the argument for whites as an entire group being beneficiaries, the same way I can't see people leasing property from the state being beneficiaries, just because it was such an interventionist system. It was such a bad system. And I think that I can't see anybody making the argument that apartheid is good economics. Because that's really the argument you would have to make in order to say that people benefited from it. I mean, people did.
Some people are making that argument. They're saying some people are actually saying that, hey, look how great apartheid worked for Afrikaners. Therefore, we must try the same. I find it absolutely bizarre. The whole reason the system collapsed was that it was bad economics. It was terrible economics. So you're right.
Yeah, I think to Morné's point, right, on firstly how like a beneficiary, how can someone who received redistributed land benefit? Like, even though there are problems, right? Now think of it, if you are someone who has an agricultural graduate, agricultural college graduates. I know there are quite a few. I was reading a story that there are thousands of them in Mpumalanga who are like, unemployed. And you are agricultural graduate, you get this redistributed parcel of land, right? To that person, like they would benefit if the government, in an ideal sense, gives you these implements, gives you funding, gives you everything, right? So like there is benefits there that can be construed. Of course, you would benefit more if you actually own the things, but there is benefit there. There's benefit there, and then come in your very hot take, right? Which I like. I love hot takes. I will consume a whole lot of sports commentary media, so hot takes are the trade of the trade. Yeah, pretty much what they do there. But yeah, concerning a hot take, I think it is in a relative sense, right? You like. This is why I hate statistics, because I think you're right? It eliminates the individuals in certain instances, right? Because then it just says, if you're white and you're poor, then kind of don't matter, because statistically more whites as a group were richer under apartheid than black people as a group. So even though you as an individual can be like, oh no, but man, I received nothing. Actually, there's like this black businessman who might have been a tad richer than me, as I was a postman probably under the apartheid government, and this person owned a taxi fleet or something. But that's to you if you're using statistical reasoning, which unfortunately is what people use when talking about groups, right? Then I think they mean it in that sense, right? In a relative sense. Of course, bad economics is bad economics, right? Everyone benefits. And then within that, when you get to the actual relative comparisons, right? Particularly given the nature of apartheid, it was like, we are just gonna be messing with these people of like black skin, and I'm like, oh, why are you doing that? So really, that is why they use that entire comparison. So if you compare using the standards that apartheid operated on, then you can see benefits. But I agree with you, of course. When something is horrible, it is horrible in the general. But I'm showing you where the benefit can be construed, and in your earlier point, how beneficiaries, actually people who have benefited from this, can see good in it.
Yeah, my feeling has always been. Sorry, Morné.
Oh, cool.
No. It's just a quick point. Is just I definitely agree that obviously these things weren't equally applied. Obviously, black people suffered far more under apartheid than white people did. But my point is just that I think that as a group, white people didn't. They also suffered under it. So it wasn't a case of this group is suffering in order to benefit another group. It was this group is suffering a lot in order to maintain a specific ideological system which the state feels that it should have control over the entire economy and most of society. And this group is actually just, they don't benefit, but they don't suffer as much. So in your postman example, it's not that he didn't really get rich. It's that he would have been richer had the system not existed. Does that make sense?
Pretty much, yeah. And I agree with that, right? Like, of course, as you said, bad economics is bad, right? But that point is bad for everyone, right? And the thing is, in South Africa, it was bad economics that had a racial premise to it. So that means that the people who actually were on the bottom rung of that racial premise would have suffered more. So I think that's what people mean. And you're correct, yeah. Even though it's like degrees of suffering instead of degrees of benefit. Yeah.
But it's So I mean, the way I've approached it is to say that everyone was a loser under apartheid, but some were obviously far, far, far bigger losers than others. But it does help one kind of, because once you kind of concede the premise that in fact somehow this system can work, I mean, we just need good vibes to run it, and then it can work. Then you basically give the state a blank check, because that's always just op-ed discourse that is nice to be like, yeah, no, this can work in the abstract, and the state is like, well, cool, we are the most incompetent people you'll ever meet, but you've given us the go ahead, so cool, thanks. So we'll make it work. And I mean, that's been the underlying, one of the underlying legitimating factors for the current kind of expropriation debate, and that is that we as libertarians and liberals and kind of just sensible people understand reality generally. We go to them and we say, okay, cool, we buy into your rhetoric of restitution, but just be careful, because look at Venezuela, look at Zimbabwe, look at virtually any other country that has tried socialism and a socialist approach to land ownership, and look what happened. And then the reply is, oh, no, yeah, sure, of course. We concede entirely that it was terrible and it's collapsed. We think they should have done it. We like that they did it, but yeah, it didn't work out great. Damn it. But we have learned from their experience, and we're doing it legally, and we're following a considered process of kind of, we have an act, we had consultations, and we're going to adopt a policy. So it's all very nicely thought out, and we're not going to make the same mistake. So my kind of caution is that you shouldn't concede that this absolutely horrible idea, be it apartheid, be it confiscation, be it state racial engineering for redress, can work, because it cannot. It cannot. And if you latch onto kind of exceptions, an exception is an exception for a reason. If you latch onto exceptions where some weird society managed to pull it off somewhere in history, I mean, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And then you have to rather address yourself to the indisputable laws of economics, that value is subjective, that you shouldn't interfere, disrupt market signals. These are things that just work always, and there's no point to fiddle with them, because then you cause humanitarian disasters.
Yeah, but Martin, you assume that that is sort of the measure of success.
For us, sure.
You almost lost me at the very beginning, because I don't think that they necessarily look at those situations in Zimbabwe or Venezuela as failures. I think, well, this is just purely speculating, but yeah. I think our government isn't really measuring the desirability of a policy based on what the economic outcomes of their policy are. I think that they have a different measure, and that measure is an ideological one, and it's a one based on representativity. It has to reflect the demographics, and a very strong bias in favor of the state, maximal state involvement in the economy. And the sort of the economic outcomes they're really only instrumental. They're really only insofar as they further the actual goal. We'll look at them, but they're not really our measure of success. But I don't know.
I agree with you. So I think their ultimate purpose is something other than growth and prosperity. I think their ultimate purpose is different. But I have seen them say, I mean, they acknowledge the reality that we have 4 million Zimbabweans in this country, in South Africa, who have fled something that is not utopia or nirvana. So I think that they do acknowledge, yeah, sure, the economy isn't great in Venezuela. It's like tough times, but their reply to this always, and I mean, this is what Cyril himself does. Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, he says that we are going to do what they did, but unlike them, we're going to do it without harming job creation, without harming food security, and without harming our investment climate. We're going to do it. We're going to have a little clause in the confiscation law that says, you may not do this arbitrarily. You must have a good reason. And they're like, look, we are proofing ourselves. Again, our ultimate goal is still representativity. It's still state social engineering, but we're going to do it in a way that shows all you naysayers that actually you can have a well-functioning economy and this other ideal goal that they've set up for themselves. And I mean, the reply is, no, you can't, and you won't. And trying is going to be an absolute disaster for everyone, especially for the poorest of the poor.
Yeah, but I guess I'm just saying that forced to choose.
Of course.
Obviously, you'd like to have both, but I think forced to choose, they'd rather have as long as they don't necessarily have to give up power.
It's their ultimate goal.
So still
forced to choose.
Yeah. Let me see, right? Let me try and stillman the opposition on why they would do this, right? For redistribution, I don't know, man. I can't be in favor of redistribution, right? I don't like the Westphalian state as a concept, as a thing that exists out there. So really, anything that is concerned with giving it the property of, like, people who are indigenous to this land, the reason I'm a libertarian, the reason I want them to own, to me, it's just a whole other series of problems, right? But for people who are in favor of this, right, Martin, like, the only way to do this is to use the exception. I don't like statistical thinking is problematic, right? Because, generalist, general, the rule disproves the exception, Poppian thinking, like, don't think world works like that. But hey, we'll give it an exception. But they would use that exception, right? For people who are in favor of the, like, I've spoken to quite well-informed EFF people, right, who'd be like, but like, look, we have Singapore. That no one owns the land in Singapore, right? Like, no one does. They all lease it from the state, and Singapore is the richest country, really, by GDP per capita in the world, I think. So you can have both, is what they will say. That is a still man position, and like,
if I can just add on to that, I mean, it happens in a different context as well by the same EFF people and others. Is this idea that kind of you can have benevolent dictatorship, and it's like, and then they point to these very specific examples, and like, we're lucky as libertarians and liberals because we can also point to one, Augusto Pinochet. We can say, look, wonderful, this dictator, absolute power. His country shot to prosperity. He was nominally kind of, he enjoyed capitalist economics. He was a friend of Milton Friedman. It's great. There is an exception, but like, I mean, the obvious rebuttal to that is, cool, I take your exception. Now let's look at literally everything else, every other time that this has been tried, and it's been a complete and utter pig's breakfast. But yeah, I mean, the other steel man, I guess, is that they would look at South Korea and so on and say, oh, but the state played a kind of
heavy role,
developmental role, a very heavy role in kind of pulling this kind of the society out of poverty, and they were smart. I am smart. They were good. They had good intentions. I have good intentions. And therefore, you can reproduce it here. So that's
Japan. Kind of, I think post World War II Japan with the United States and everything, very statist involved, particularly in their land program. I was actually recommended a paper by someone who was associated with AFF about Japan's land redistribution program. So I'll be reading that over the weekend.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think this segues kind of nicely into kind of this the budget this week. I mean, it comes quite close to the idea of the developmental state and how the notion of cutting spending is completely off the table. Carol Payton, the journalist on News 24, she writes, tax hikes or debt. Those are the two options that we had. Oh my goodness. And I wondered, is there a third option to kind of securing a country's fiscal imbalance? What could it be? Morné, what do you do when you are like, you're enjoying life and you have lots of subscriptions and you're paying for lots of things, and suddenly you find your bank is telling you, you're not going to make it. What do you do? Do you steal money from your neighbor?
Yes.
Gun? Or, okay, cool. Yeah, so that's what you do, Zakes. You take out a loan from your bank that the bank knows you can't repay. But you know me, I'm the reasonable one. I cut some of the spending that I end some of the subscriptions. But yeah, you guys do it.
No, you the unreasonable one. I mean, clearly you're unreasonable. Who does that? Who cuts the spending when their income is less than it? Who does that? No one does that. So silly. I mean, you get more debt. That's what you do.
Absolutely. It's easy.
To me, it's quite clear that every single cent that the government spends is absolutely necessary and absolutely optimally utilized. I can't think of any single place where they could, cut even a little bit. But I mean, we're joking, but does anybody believe that? Does Enoch Godongwana believe that? Does he believe that there's just no no place whatsoever. You can't cut it. It's not a case of, there are some things which we're not willing to cut. There's whatever, the grants, the education. There are certain elements in the budget which simply can't touch. But surely there are some which we
Can't be
could.
touched.
Well, according to Edgar
surely.
Sishi, head of the budget office, said that for Treasury, that was not really the point. If government wants to spend, it is the role and responsibility of Treasury to fund it. So, I mean, that's an utterly bizarre take. It's like, it doesn't matter if Treasury thinks we can afford it or not. We must just fund it. I mean, people say we're this constitutional democracy, but you'd imagine that in a constitutional democracy, the state's chief finance officer, the Minister of Finance, can say, hey guys, we actually can't afford this. But no. You can't say that. If the government wants something, it's the responsibility of Treasury to fund it. It just shows the premises of government in this country are so perverse in a very real sense that it's almost seen as taboo to imply that Enoch Gorongwana, who I kind of like, I thought he was relatively sensible, to imply that he must tell his colleagues, hey guys, the money's up. It's over. It's time to cut. Of course he must. It's just that must be his main job, is to bring fiscal sanity to the state.
Yeah, not in South Africa, but you can go too, Morné. You wanted to say something.
No, it's just to make it clear to people because what's the shortfall they're trying to make up with the 2% VAT increase, which we actually haven't mentioned yet. That's why the budget didn't happen. Is that evidently all the parties in the GNU we're just not willing to countenance an increase in VAT or 2% increase in VAT. And I have quite a bit of sympathy for that. But I mean, the shortfall they're trying to address is it's 60 billion rand, something like that. And I mean, that's in a budget of, what is it? 2.6 trillion. So that's 2,600 billion. And we're talking about a shortfall of 60. You're telling me there's no 60 billion in that budget that could have been better spent elsewhere. I don't think people realize how much money our government actually spends. It's an absolutely ridiculous amount. And
the obvious place to cut. I mean, so I'm always gonna harp on this, is that I think the plurality of our budget is the wage bill, isn't it, Morné? I think it's more or less that. That's the biggest single item, is paying state staff.
Wage bill now, and paying for debt.
Yes, okay, let's leave the debt because I think you can't really escape that. So you can't really cut that spending. But as far as the state
I have a very hot take about that.
I'll let you get into that. But I mean, the obvious easy thing is you cut wage bill, because you have absolutely horrible state employees in this country. So and I'm always going to throw the DA under the bus for this. So when I think this was last year, I think it started before the GNU was formed, but it obviously continued afterwards. The Department of Education, or the finance minister or whoever, said that they have to cut spending to provincial education departments and to education in general. And I was like, this is, wow, finally some sense prevails, some sense. Surely the DA will be very happy with this grand opportunity that's been given to the Western Cape Department of Education to now on firm footing fire the bad teachers. What a wonderful reason. We just cannot pay you anymore. Take it to Enoch, go and ask Enoch about it. Don't ask us about it. We have to fire you. But now instead, I got emails and I saw press releases of DA people saying this is an absolute tragedy. They're cutting our education budget. And this continued obviously under Siviwe Garuba, who wants her department to have more money. And it's like, listen, you're spitting in the faces of anyone who has looked at education in this country and seen what an utter and unmitigated disaster it is. These teachers, there are great teachers, but they are spread in amongst a sea of absolute incompetence. And really, You just have to fire them. And I think almost in education alone, if you fire all the terrible teachers, I know you're going to have to stare down the unions. That's the easy part. I'm talking about the hard part, which is making the decision to actually do it when your ideology tells you not to. If you actually fire the bad teachers, I think you're almost going to be ready to cover that 60 billion rand shortfall. But there's going to be bad nurses, there's going to be bad doctors, there's going to be whole kind of legions of administrators in this country who actually don't do anything. If you really come down to it, they don't actually do anything. Yeah. If you fire those people, you'll make up your budget shortfall.
That's true. That's true. I think with your last point about administrators, right? I find it very hard. It's a hard sell for me as a taxpayer to say, hey, I'm going to pay my taxes the same way, and there are going to be less people doing the things that those taxes are supposed to be doing. So I get why like fire the administrators. For instance, in the education ministry, like let's fire every administrator before we get to the teachers at a political level. But let us not say that we can't fire anyone. And I agree with that. But I'm like, there are a whole lot of administrators. The nature of the state, right, is that there's like for every single teacher, there are probably like 4 administrators above them who are their managers and a manager's manager. That is really the biggest problem. But in South Africa, I think like our biggest problem, right, I was reading concerning our wage bill, is that we don't even have a high headcount. We don't have a lot of people employed by the state compared to like other similar size economies, actually. But we have such a high wage bill because the few people we do have are paid so much, like paid at world-breaking levels, right? So when you combine their salaries and their benefits and everything like that. So I think that is a much more harder conversation for these people to have, like, but I think when presented with an option of you lose your job or we cut your salary, people would make very rational decisions then, right? But in South Africa, that is not even a possibility. That is what like disheartens me about this past week, right? Is that it wasn't even a possibility that was considered. When you look at even Kotongwana, right, who is great, he every time he has spoken about cutting the wage bill is through some voluntary severance packages, and I'm like, if you're gonna let people choose to leave, all the good people will leave. You'll be left with all the horrible people because the good people know they can get employed somewhere else. So you'll just make them rich, and it will be so horrible. Like, man, like, and I get it comes from a good place. His plan of like, oh no, voluntary severance, encourage people early retirement. I'm like, no. All the good people will leave and just go in, and instead you have to hire them back as consultants, is what they do half the time, because you'll be left with extremely horrible people. So yeah, no, like we have to entertain the idea of firing people. I've been screaming about this really for the past 2 or 3 years. I try to write about our fiscal position and taxes every so often, because to me, it is like it has been the biggest really problem to me, and it has been nice seeing Treasury revise when they will consolidate the debt to GDP ratio. It was like at 25%, now it's at 75%, and they keep on revising it like, oh no, in 2025, oh no, in 2023 or in 2026. So it won't happen until fundamental changes happen. But yeah, government cuts and the economy to grow. I think we need both, and like we can't have a growing economy because there'll constantly be this need of spending. That's because we aren't cutting. So it's like a very scary cycle. Like, I don't think people realize how scary the cycle we are in is. And of course, we are fighting with our third biggest trading partner in the US. So like this is a great time for our economy.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize that those two things are related. The lack of economic growth and the actual growth in government. It's not a case of, it would be nice to have both. It's the case of, the one is actually making it harder to get the other one. The fact that we have a growing government is making it harder for us to have a growing economy. And I mean, it's just, there are some states, and this is the argument most people will make, is that government can, by spending, it has a sort of multiplier effect, and that can have positive economic benefits. Now, even Treasury doesn't believe that the way in which our government spends money has a positive effect. We have a negative multiplier so government's taking money out of the economy, and they're spending it in ways and probably losing it in ways which is far worse than that money just not existing at all. I mean, that's it, and it's astonishing. It's sort of an economic anomaly we have at the moment, is that we'd almost be better off if government just taxed it and burnt it than we would the way that they are actually spending the
I
money
vote
at
for
the
that.
moment. No,
I mean,
I'd rather
Morné, you
rather
and
they not tax it.
yeah, I would keep the money, but I would rather they burn it rather than use it to regulate me. But so, I mean, you and I did a calculation last week for an article that I wrote about. It was about land reform, but effectively, the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants said that South Africa lost round about 1.5 trillion rand to corruption between 2014 and 2019. And long story short, effectively that money, just the money that the government had and then stole and gave to friends and family, just that, forget about all the other money. If you just took that, that could, if almost, I think, I can't quite remember what we concluded on, Morné, but that could almost allow the government to, through the willing buyer, willing seller approach, basically buy all agricultural land in the country at market value. And then the state has all this property, which it can either keep for itself and give to friends and family, or it can give to people in ownership. But bottom line is, the state had that money, it taxed that money out of the productive economy, and it could have used that in a way that Treasury might regard as multiplier. But no, instead, the reality of spending in this country, the reality of it, not the theory about how Norway does it or how kind of Thomas Sankara may have done it in Burkina Faso. That, forget it. The reality of spending in this country is that the money is stolen and it is incompetently utilized and wasted on nonsense. If you just look at the tender process, where we pay 50,000 rand for a broomstick or something from tender entrepreneurs, that is the reality of how money is spent. That's not going to have a multiplier effect. That is obviously going to have a very harmful kind of suppression of economic activity effect. And I mean, I describe myself as an ideologue. I describe myself as an academic, but I am intensely frustrated by people who refuse to engage with the reality of how politics in this country works. And instead, I mean, like we discussed with land reform, they say, oh, but look, Singapore did it. They have state ownership of everything. So therefore we can do it. It's like, no, they had some other steps before they could get there. You cannot just say, they did it, therefore copy paste here. We have shown that our political class in this country is unable to be a sensible custodian of public money. I am a libertarian. I think individuals are always going to be better custodians of their own money than the state. But the reality is, in some countries, not all politicians are criminals. It happens, I know, shocking. But in some countries, there are politicians who actually know how to do their jobs, and they take their job seriously. And when they do tax people and they do steal from people, they use that money in a way that is passably sensible. That is not this country. That is something else. And we need to deal with the reality that we face in South Africa. And maybe in 1,000 years, our political kind of reality would have changed, and maybe then we can have a big welfare state and all work. I will still oppose it if I still am alive in 1,000 years. Here's hoping, but that is not currently the reality, and it's bizarre that we are so unable to engage with the practice rather than the theory of how things should be working.
Yeah, and this is just sort of, it gets me. One thing I've realized is that, well, a lot of people agree that this whole right-wing, left-wing, and conservative liberal, or conservative progressive, they aren't always very useful terms in order to discuss reality. But one thing I have noticed is that there is nobody as conservative as a progressive who's currently in power, because you cannot convince that person that they have to change anything. There's just no way. Like you can convince them that they should, ramp up what they're doing, but there's just no way you can convince them to do something other than what they are doing currently. And that's just, I mean, looking at this, for those of you who don't know, the budget speech and the budget review, which we would have seen, has leaked in the meantime, or I think it's leaked. I'm not sure whether it was released.
I don't think,
formally.
yeah, I think it was released formally, and then Treasury was like, it won't be taking any questions until March.
Yeah, that's what I thought would happen. But
Yeah.
I mean, it has this section where it basically shows what the trends were for the past decade. So what's it, the 2014-15 to 2023-2024, the previous year. So it's just in the last decade. And here, I mean, let me just mention some of these figures. So government debt rose from 1.7 trillion to 5.2 trillion. So we have been doing debt. So the public burden on working age individuals of government debt, by the way, went up from 70,000 to 104. Well, let's call it 115,000. So that's how much you owe on behalf of the government, or the government owes on behalf of you as a working age person. Now, during the same decade, real GDP per person fell from 80,000 to 74,000. What do we see here? The government spending went up from 1.2 trillion in 2014-15 to 2.6, which outpaced, obviously, inflation. And then they have this little note here that says, despite this increase in total spending, there was no corresponding improvement in economic output. But the fact is, the numbers are there. We've done this approach for decades now. At the very least, let's try something else. Nobody has to be convinced that the free market is the best, but can we sort of convince you that let's just try something else? We have tried this way of doing things, and I don't think that, and we all agree that the results are bad, but I don't think the answer is to do even more of the thing that brought you bad results. And that's just the absolutely shocking nature.
You are missing something important here. The reason the economy did not perform so well is because the government didn't spend enough. That is why. We needed to spend more. You told the government debt rose from 1 trillion to 5 trillion. We need those are rookie numbers in this racket. Those are rookie numbers in this racket. We need to up those numbers. We need to get those. We need to be helping in the upper 10 trillions there. Then we're cooking. Then we're a proper developmental state.
I mean, to some degree, they do acknowledge that they're wrong. I mean, the way you kind of test for this is that if you have an idea of having a special economic zone, you just say, okay, cool. You have this absolutely cuck policy. Fine. We're not gonna kind of attack you on that. Give me a 5 by 5 kilometer plot somewhere. Whatever, make it as small as you possibly want to. Make it as small as Monaco or as small as the Vatican City, whatever. And then just exempt that area from the laws that we identify. Like, I'm not going to force anyone to move there or anything like that. All voluntary, kind of open border situation. The government won't even do that. Because why wouldn't they? There's no cost. There is no cost to that. You can find a farm anywhere in this country. The farmer will say, cool, I'll give you that little piece of property. This will be exempted. It will be what do they call it? A special city, or what's Ramampara's thing? But whatever, it's going to be that city. And
smart city.
Yeah, and a smart city. It's going to be a smart city, and it's going to be, the government doesn't have to spend a cent on it. Just exempt that little portion of land from your CAC laws. The government will not do that. Why will it not do that? Because it knows within 5 years, within 10 years, that 1 by 1 kilometer piece of land is going to look like Hong Kong, with people living on top of each other in forced small little spaces, because they are going to get more prosperity there. They're going to get jobs there. They're going to get low taxes there. There's going to be production, believe it or not, because the market just works. And the government knows this. They know this. They know that this small concession will completely blow their kind of model out of the water. They know this. Otherwise, they would have made the concession. So yeah, it's It's quite something, and that's why I keep saying on social media, listen, you don't hate the government enough. These people are your enemies. These people are not just kind of struggling; they are actively suppressing you. You do not hate the government enough.
Yeah, yeah. They truly do suck. They truly do suck.
Yeah. Just before someone in the comments mentions it, we do have special, quote unquote, special economic zones in South Africa.
The quotation marks are quite necessary.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's sort of the specialty of our government, is that they take the names of these concepts which work in other countries, they give you a very distorted, very statist version of that, and then they say, well, that didn't work. Look at that. We tried the market. I mean, it was actually quite a few years ago where they sort of picked up the special economic zone idea because it had been so incredibly successful in China and elsewhere, but particularly in China. And so they said, okay, well, let's try that out. And what did they do? They immediately said, okay, so we'll give you, I don't know, maybe like a little bit of a tax break, but it's only for, companies that manufacture cars. And you also have to have these specific employment rules, and you have to have, these specific ownership requirements. And it's the exact opposite of what the special economic zone is supposed to be. It's actually just a little pod of central planning which pays a little bit less tax most of the time, or which has one specific thing that's a handful of things that they're getting a bit of relief from. And the worst of it all is that's some places actually take that up. I mean, it's being exempt from just one or two things is actually worthwhile every now and then.
It is.
But
I'm sorry, Morné, this is testing me because I know this. Like when I was researching, because I love being informed about China, right? So their SEZs are always like things I'm reading about. And what is this? I think Port Elizabeth or East London. I forgot which
Port Elizabeth,
city.
yeah.
Port Elizabeth, yeah. They took it up. Yeah, Gqeberha there is in a special economic zone, but you'd be surprised. Like you wouldn't be able to tell. And the car manufacturing one is extremely interesting, right? Because the only reason the car manufacturing even exists in the Eastern Cape is thanks to large part to government largesse and everyone in the country being forced to pay higher prices on cars because of the obscene taxes that the government puts on them to try and prop up that industry. And that is an industry that is propped up and has an SEZ according to the state, and still it is barely functional. Like, oh man, like our special economic zones are the opposite.
It means
of
SEZs cannot work. Surely that's what it means. It means
we tried it. It didn't work.
And the disheartening part is that like they have access to, I'm sure they have access to people in the CCP, right? It's like technical people who are informed about how this is supposed to look. Yet they always seemingly get these ideas, even from China, that are free market aligned, and they come here and they get the most leftist academics to draft up the policies, and it's like, oh yeah, as Morné said, it ends up being a tax break that's not really a tax break, that's tied down to BEE regulations.
Tiny
really,
discount.
And just
more
to be
South
clear,
Africa.
They go to the CCP, which is the Communist Party. They look at their policies and they say, "Ooh, a little right wing, if you ask me." I think we should just make this a little bit more statist.
Way too free market fundamentalist. Those communists.
No, but I mean, it's just so transparent that, I mean, if they really believe that this doesn't work, they would just say, okay, fine, like 20 kilometers north of Uppington, we're giving you a parcel of desert. Like, whatever, you're gonna go and play in the sand. It's like, why are they not even willing to do that? And that is because they're not stupid. The evidence is in, guys. The evidence is in that where you have lower burdens, of state interference, there is more economic activity, fruitful and productive economic activity. And this is known to our opponents. And I'm sure if you kind of put it to them, they'll say, yeah, but these businesses will bring all their employees with them and they'll kind of exploit them. They won't pay the minimum wage and so on. And it's like, well, fine, cool. Just do a survey. Just do it, try it for 5 years, then survey the employees and ask them, listen, you want to come back to Alex or to Soweto and kind of come and live here again, or do you want to live in this kind of Hong Kong in the Kalahari Desert? What do you prefer? And the evidence is there. The people flee from less economically exploitative countries to more economically exploitative countries every single day in their tens of thousands. People want to be exploited. They desperately want to be exploited for economic gain. All of us do.
That is true. You see it in China too, right? Like the Chinese figure this out because they have a large rural population. So like they have pretty much an unending labor force, so which is why their worker protections can be non-existent to the point of non-payment, right? It's normal in China to work a couple of months without being paid, and that is because the company performs better. Us paying salaries. It is truly the wild west there. But the thing is, you still see, right, a large, like millions Chinese rural dwellers moving from the rural areas of China and going to these places like Shenzhen, where there are SEZs, and pretty much, as you say, moving from less exploitative conditions to try and get exploited in the cities, right? Leaving their rice paddies and everything to try and get exploited in the city. But that shows you how the comparison really, and being exploited and not being exploited, seemingly human beings want to be exploited. And interestingly enough, when they're exploited, they become fatter, live longer, generally all those things that are associated with comfortable living, that horrible exploitation.
Yeah, I mean, it
sounds
was
like
some
a lot
socialist.
of false consciousness.
It is, and it's wonderful. I mean, it was a socialist woman who wrote this, who said that the only thing worse than being exploited in the capitalist economy is not being exploited at all. I can't remember her name, but she's a socialist economist, and she even acknowledged this. I mean, it is so patently clear that exploitation is how economies work. We want to derive benefit from each other, and to the degree that your employer is exploiting you, you are obviously exploiting them as well. You are exploiting them for something that is in their pocket that you want in your pocket. I mean, this is it's worrying how such a basic thing, such a basic reality of market interaction is still something that people struggle with. Because just understanding that basic thing would tend to sap this argument in the discourse of, we need to lower exploitation. That would disappear when people understand that every interaction in the economy, voluntary interaction, is mutually beneficial, it's mutually exploitative, and that's how it works. But no,
that really
we have
gets
the
back.
zero-sum mentality.
That's really the same reason why, as Zach said earlier, that people aren't allowed to own the land on which they want to farm. That's the exact same logic. It's left to their own devices. People will just, we've got these potential employees who would just make bad deals and be exploited, and it's better to have them, not work than to have them work under those circumstances. And actually, on the point of exploitation, on the point of work, we had the unemployment numbers this week as well. And Zakes, I think you wrote something up on that, or did a video or something like that.
That's true.
Please tell the listeners, is there more or less exploitation going on?
Pretty much, we need more exploitation, because given our numbers, close to half of the people who could be working aren't working, and they're, I'm sure, enjoying not being exploited at home, right? But yeah, man, the QLFS is always a depressing, episode. I remember the last time we did it, I'm like, man, this is some depressing stuff, right? Because when you look at the numbers, like, just numbers, the expanded definition of unemployment did not change. Only actual unemployment decreased by 0.2%. But I'm saying if the expanded definition did not change, then it means that unemployment did not change, really. So nothing has changed. And even if it were to drop, like, man, this is so scary. Even if unemployment were to drop by 20% in South Africa in one quarter, we'd still be sitting with over 20% unemployment. That is scary stuff, right?
Mm.
They're using the expanded definition, right? Because it's like currently 41%. So if the expanded definition were to drop by 20%, something that would be great, should be celebrated, would still be in trouble. And I'm like, man, that is scary stuff to think about. But yeah, QLFS
Yeah.
released, and we need exploitation.
Yeah, but I mean, just like you said, Zach, so you sort of look at the figures and you forget that there's people inside those figures. I mean, those aren't just numbers. And just to your point, I think it's, talking off the top of my head here, I think it's around 12.5 million people who are basically unemployed under the broader definition. So that incorporates both the unemployed and looking for work, as well as the unemployed and not looking for work, or the discouraged work seekers, and then other forms of not economically active people, but people who aren't in education or training or employment or anything like that. So 12.5 million. So let's say you half unemployment. You've still got over 6 million people in the country who can't find a job, and it's just, I don't think people realize the extent, the enormity of this crisis that we're in. We sort of spoke off the cuff, and neither one of us could remember the numbers precisely, but we did that comparison between the absolute number of unemployed people in South Africa at the moment versus the US in the worst depression it had ever experienced, the Great Depression. That's why it's called that. And not only are we higher as a percentage, there's actually, despite the vast population differences, we have more absolute people unemployed than the US did in the Great Depression. And that's despite the fact that their population was, even at that stage, much, much larger than ours is right now.
Yeah, and I guess the saddest part of this is that it's a chosen condition.
Again,
South Africa,
we've done it this way, and that's the way we're going to do it, and we will not countenance any suggestions about changing anything ever. I just wish people could see.
No, exactly. So I mean,
how crazy that is.
South Africa is, let's say, arguably the most sophisticated economy on the continent. It's not the biggest one, but I would say it's probably the most sophisticated. And yet it is, I mean, Africa, the dark continent, the continent of poverty. We are the second most unemployed country in the world. In the world, not like on the planet. We're only beaten by Eswatini, by Swaziland, which is basically kind of an unofficial province of South Africa. But
I was going to say that
Zimbabwe has less unemployment than we do. I mean, countries that have nothing, the Gambia has less unemployment than we do. It is a complete choice. We choose this. And yeah, I mean, that to me it's sick. It's sick because the solutions are there. Unemployment is not a head scratcher. It is not a head scratcher. If you go to these webinars of people saying, it's complicated. No, it's easy. It's easy. It's easy to solve unemployment because other countries have done it many times. You can just do what they did. You deregulate your labor market. You deregulate your economy in general. And you let people work. You take your academic kind of idealisms out of people's business and you let them choose for themselves. And unemployment will be solved within less than a generation. I'm willing to bet that to anyone. I will bet my life savings to some EFFer. If we deregulate labor entirely, that within a generation, our unemployment crisis will be solved. I'm very willing to bet that. It's easy. It's easy.
That's true. That's true. That is what is so disheartening. I'm sorry, Morné, but like to Martin's point, what's so disheartening is that we choose to do this, right? Like really, it is a matter of will, and the choice that is not being taken, or the choice that is being taken, depending on how you're looking at it, is like the result of it is that people by their millions, have no ability. I was talking to Morné, and he was like, man, he didn't think of it that way, about how like beyond them being able to sustain themselves, like think of all the possible things we could be getting from all those millions of South Africans who are just sitting at home, like all the services, all the products, all the innovations, everything, just the productive capacity as a society collectively we are losing, when like more than 10 million of the people who could be working just aren't. That is scary stuff. That is scary stuff. But yeah.
No,
So
absolutely.
yeah, you can go through, Morné.
Yeah.
No, it's just, I mean, and I was just going to mention, Martin, that, and this is to a large extent, I mean, it's true that we've had a very high unemployment rate for some time, but it isn't something that the government merely inherited, and it isn't something that's, just stubbornly sticking at a particular point. It's gotten significantly worse and continues to get worse. And it just seems like it's just ridiculous that nobody wants to change anything.
Yeah, no, I mean it really is it's an emergency, it's a crisis, and we've normalized it. I think this is something you also said, Zakes, in the press release for the Free Market Foundation, that said we've normalized it in the same way we've normalized violent crime in this country. We talk about this as if it's just, well, life stuff. When in any other country, like you just spoke about the US, they would be saying we are in the midst of our Great Depression. Like this is a historical event in the history of our nation, is X number of people are unemployed, and South Africa is like, shit happens, and then
It
I mean
happens. Here's the 2% vet hike.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then like lashing us with a shambok to kind of make it even worse, as bad as they can. And yeah, I mean, it's that point you just made, as we conclude here, Zakes, is actually a very sad one. Is that we see the masses of unemployed as kind of unskilled labor who are waiting to kind of come and work with their hands, which is very important, and we do need them to do that, absolutely. But the big loss is the potential intellectual property that all these people have. Not all of them have, but interspersed amongst them are truly exceptional individuals who we will never benefit from because they just cannot get a foot in the door. And it's not that they cannot get a foot in the door, it's that when they try to put their foot in the open door, the government slaps it away with that shambok. And I mean, that is injustice. That is real tangible injustice.
So to your point, Martin, about the intellectual property, I'm reading something. Well, I've been reading it for a couple of months, so I'm doing a bad job. But about the Wright brothers, right, and how they invented, aeroplanes. Like they worked with their hands too. So actually, the thing about people being shut off from the door, right, is that let us take everyone who's the millions of unemployed and skilled, right. These are people, if they aren't being productive, they aren't getting any skills, because if you're productive, you're producing something, right? And like the greatest of inventions have actually come from people who worked with their hands, including said Wright brothers. And the Wright brothers are interesting because simultaneously as they invented the aeroplane, the US government was giving funding to someone to try and invent the very same thing. That shows you that government is really stupid in whatever instance, because they would spend millions probably on some scientists to try and invent an aeroplane, and some dudes who built bicycles were like, yeah, I can put this together. So yeah.
Well, they actually funded a bunch of academics who said, "Oh, it's impossible, can't be done." They actually said there's some or other limit to how fast these things can go, and it's just impossible to do it. Meanwhile, people, a bunch of guys were running around in their backyard.
And we're like, I think I can fly. But so all those people, when they are barred, Martin, as you said, from just entering the door, right? That's they don't even get the skills so that they could potentially have the IP. Like, man, it is sad. It is super sad.
No, absolutely. And I mean, on that note, I mean, that's a good point to end on, is don't look to government to tell you what is possible, what is good, and what is productive. Liberate yourself psychologically from the state, because once you've done that, everything else will eventually reveal itself to us as a group of people who are kind of in the spontaneous order trying to solve problems. And the more we stare into this wall of the state and its destructive policies, we're actually just denying ourselves the ability to progress. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a good note to end on. So gentlemen, thank you very much for another hour and a half of your time on this Rational Standard podcast. To everyone watching live, I see we had about 11 concurrent watchers live, which is much better than previous weeks. So thank you very much. The only thing you didn't do, which we instructed you to do, is to please send us your comment.
We appreciate everyone from the previous weeks too.
Yeah, we do. But UK, you are latecomers. But the current group is here right now. But yeah, we would appreciate you guys engaging with us as we have this conversation, telling us where you agree, where you disagree. Maybe you have some insights of your own. Please do that from next week. We really want some engagement. This show really should be an engaging conversation, not just between those of us on video, but also with you, really our community. And ultimately, we are doing this for you. And we want to know what you enjoy, what you disagree with, what you agree with. Just get into a conversation with us. But that doesn't mean we don't appreciate everyone who's going to see this later. Please, you can also leave comments on below the video, which if there's anything noteworthy, we will pick up on in our next show. But yeah, please like this video if you've enjoyed it, share it. Above all, please subscribe to this channel so you can see all of our newest content. And yeah, as I said last week, we expect the craziness to continue. Doesn't seem to be letting up. There's a budget is coming second week of March, we believe. And yeah, between now and then, there's going to be a lot more nonsense coming from the South African government to chat about and around the world. So yes, everyone, enjoy your weekend. And we will catch you next week, Friday. Goodbye.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Cool.